So we all know logically that human babies, the ones younger than this one, are completely dependent and vulnerable. Animal babies are born with varying abilities, from those that enter the world alone, apart from any parents, and must survive on their own from the very start, to those that rely on a parent for milk and nourishment, but are also able to walk, or at least crawl, from very soon after birth. But human babies seem to me to be among the most vulnerable of all baby creatures in the world. It was a few months after my first child was born that the weight of this struck me in a way that's a bit hard to convey. We were living in New York City, and Jack was a baby that not just liked to be held, but pretty much demanded to be held around the clock. After a couple months, after the initial and amazing help and support of family members who dropped everything to help care for me and Jack, after they had to return home, a thought came to me and refused to leave my awareness. This baby cannot move himself from place to place. I know it's really obvious. Of course, I knew that before I became a parent, but the weight of this reality surrounded me. When I walked our dog, I had to carry the baby. When I went to my new mom's group, I carried Jack in a really big full diaper bag. When I needed groceries, I schlepped Jack along and could only buy as many groceries at a time that I could manage to carry back home while also carrying a baby. Every task became complicated by the need to carry this tiny human along with me. I've gotten a little better at it. But every time I tried to explain the weight of this realization to other new moms, to my spouse, to whoever, it just sounded sort of feeble and obvious. It was somehow the sticking point for me that felt harder in some way than feeding him, harder than the diaper changes and burping and all the spitting up and crying. He was completely dependent on me to move him from here to there and there to here. And I had so many more months ahead of me of carrying him. Every Christmas, when we hear this well-known story of Jesus' birth, we know Jesus comes as a tiny baby, small and vulnerable. We know that this helpless baby is somehow also God. We know all this, but it's still hard to feel that soul-level acknowledgement of the absurdity of it. To really recognize what it means that God, love eternal, wisdom divine, the creator of the universe, this almighty, omnipotent, omniscient being, that God becomes a human baby. God chooses to become a human baby, completely dependent on others for absolutely everything. God, who is so huge that God's existence is beyond space and time. This God, incarnate in Jesus, cannot move God's self from here to there and there to here. God in Jesus chooses vulnerability and relationship, exposing God's very self and relying on human love and care, and hazarding all the risks of life and love. This doesn't begin to touch on the manner of God's birth, that even from birth, God is subject to human powers. For the very place of Jesus' birth is subject to the decrees of an emperor. God enters the world among animals, this holy, eternal being that puts on flesh and blood. The stars, at least, recognize the majesty of this seemingly ordinary baby. Among humans, simple shepherds are the first to know and welcome and worship him. The one chosen to birth God, Jesus' mother, is a girl who has no particular standing, and her qualifications are simply her willingness to trust God, her vision of God's power that could topple empires, and her quiet thoughtfulness as she observes God at work in the world. Jesus will teach us explicitly that the first will be last and the last will be first, that we would do well to welcome God as a small child, that the power of the world is nothing compared to love, that we're completely missing the point if we seek power and glory instead of love and grace. But we see these lessons in Jesus' life before he preaches a single word, when he is all cries and coos, before he can speak, when the mother who held him and nurtured him within her body for 9 months continues to hold him and carry him because he cannot yet walk or even crawl on his own. God favors the poor. God blesses the meek, the hungry and thirsty, the persecuted and the oppressed. God stands on the margins with those who have the greatest need, and God holds closely those who grieve. Beginning with Christmas, with the birth of Emmanuel, we witness God's remarkable upside-down kingdom. In Jesus' birth, God shows us what has value. Not money or power, not prestige or glory, but rather our mutual vulnerability, our interdependence, every small, simple, ordinary act of love. Like a mother rocking a baby, like the sharing of food, like the singing of God's praise, whether through our hymns or through the shining of a star in the sky. As we care for one another with empathy, tenderness, and grace, we embody God's love just as Jesus did. As we place the needs of the community above what we want as we worship online for 2 weeks to protect the vulnerable and the frontline medical workers, we embody God's love. As we place our hope not in corporations and consumption, but in love and peace, mercy and grace, we embody Christmas. That light shines in the darkness, love casts out fear, and God could live among us as a tiny baby. As we recognize the divine around us in every person, regardless of age or class or gender or profession, we open ourselves to the vulnerability of relationship and connection that God risks as Jesus enters the world as a baby. This Christmas, every Christmas, may we bear witness to God's birth to bring more light and more love to the world. Amen.